thanks to the Re-Articulation for the invitation, which is quite challenging but interesting for me because I don't know much, almost nothing, to be honest, about architecture. And but I'm going to speak both things that I hope will be useful for answering this question. Or is architecture political? I must say that before, so there is no way in which I could prepare to answer them. And in fact, now I realize that even if I had read them, it would have been difficult because they are so different, and it would have been really difficult to have some kind of coherent. See them before. I decided to prepare something to answer the following question. Well, of course, the question which we were asked to pose, but in this way, how to envisage the question of the political. I want to insist that I'm not trying to give the answer to the question of how is architecture political, but how is architecture political when it is approached from the point of view of the hegemonic on this point, because I think that different approach, and particularly different understanding of the political, are going to answer this question in different ways. Because we say the political, of the political. So if we just can't take it for granted that when we use that term, we refer to the same thing, and that can lead to many confusions. To this question, what is the political distinguish? There are broadly, I say, two different approaches. One which has been called the associative conception of the political, that is the conception of the political as acting in common, the consensus, and there is the dissociative approach, for which the political is got to do with conflict, with antagonism. Well, of course, it's clear that my position really belongs to the dissociative approach. This is in the different way in which agonism is understood, because the term agonism is also a term that you find, in different approaches, and there's absolutely no it's not a term that I invented, nor a term that agonism. The difference basically comes from, if you start from a point of view of understanding the political as associative way or in a dissociative way. So as I was saying, my position is dissociative, and I propose to make this. I want to refer to the antagonistic dimension which exists necessarily in social relation, and I'm going to say something about that in a moment. And so it's something which is in fact political. The political is an ontological, meta-political, if you want to call it like that, thesis. And then there is what I call the political, which is the ensemble of practice, discourse, language game, which human coexistence, but in conditions which are always conflictual, because they are traversed, they exist in an ontological context in which there is always the possibility of antagonism. So we could say that the ontic and the political is situated at the level of the ontological. So they are in fact, this distinction, the political and politics, lead us to the two main concepts that we have argued in Laclos. There are two fundamental concepts aboard this question of political. First, the concept of antagonism, and then the concept of hegemony. The concept of antagonism is precisely everything which refers to this level of what I call the political negativity, which impedes the totalization of society and foreclose every possibility of a society beyond division and beyond power. It is different from the Marxist negativity or the Hegelian negativity. Because of course we find the idea of negativity in those two approaches, but it is a negativity that can always be overcome. So there is always the possibility of approach. There is a form of radical negativity that it's impossible to be overcome. I don't have time here to develop that philosophically, but for instance, I definitively, of course, approach the division of the subject in Freud is something society is also necessarily divided. I've used in my work the notion of the constitutive outside, which is a term which is of theme in Derrida, for instance, différence with A. Normally the term différence is written with but in Derrida, when he wants to insist on this question of, in fact, the aim of Staten is to bring together all those themes and say, but basically, Derrida is alluding there, is that in order to create any form of identity, distinguish them from something, which is not an A, non-A, but this non-A, and I insist here, it's at the level, it can be in terms of personal identity, but also at the level of every form of objective. It's not just, separated empirically. The outside is the very condition of possibility of the inside. So this is, in fact, it's a condition of possibility, which is also a condition of impossibility of a. This is what Derrida criticized in the idea of the metaphysics of the presence. And I mean, this, of course, is something which is very important, because it shows that this negativity, something that cannot be objectivity. Well, I stop here because it will take us into a much longer philosophical discussion. But so this is important. This is something which the political consequences are that a society completely the other concept, the concept of hegemony, is a concept which of course is very much linked to that, because to recognize this dimension of radical negativity indicate that we must also acknowledge the lack of a final foundationalist, the undesirability that pervades every order. There is always form of order, or always, there are not always, but usually there are form of order, but those establish order in a context which is always a context of contingency. This category of contingency is also absolutely central into our approach. And the practices that aim of establishing called hegemonic practices. So the main thesis here is that every order is an hegemonic order. It is the temporary and precarious articulation of hegemony on the exclusion of other possibilities. And it is always the expression of a particular configuration of power relation. An hegemony is always configuration of power relation, and they are always on this point, because later on I'm going to make reference to that. It's always organized around certain what we call nodal points, or to use the language of Lacan, point de capitaux. This hegemony there is something which is always organized in which are particularly important in order to structure an hegemony. And of course, this is those points that need to be addressed, disarticulated in order to establish another hegemony. Well, what I want particularly suited to grasp the role of cultural and artistic practices, and I think that this is where we should, of course, locate architectural practices, even if there are some specificity of architecture, obviously. To grasp their role in the establishment of an hegemonic order. Because here, of course, the important is to show that what's called the social is always discursively current, to the point made by Renaud Martin. We don't distinguish, like Anna Arendt, the social and the political, because for us, they are not two. The social is, in fact, always political. It's the result and can be made and is made, but it's a methodological distinction. We don't refer to really, things of a different nature. The social is the result of sedimented hegemonic political practices. That's for us absolutely central. The social is sedimentation of hegemonic practices. Then the question is to see how and it is, let's see, through a multiplicity of discursive practices. multiplicity of discursive practices, and among those practices, cultural and artistic practices play a very crucial role. That's a point, for instance, that Antonio Gramsci is repeatedly for civil society, in the establishment of an hegemony, and in the establishment of what Gramsci called the common sense. But the common sense not in the way in which is understood normally by people, the natural sense. The common sense for Gramsci is always the result of something which is very product of an hegemony. But of course, the common sense is become naturalized, and it's appear. I mean, it defines at a given moment what is possible, what we can expect. That is sedimentation of hegemonic practices, and so I think that this approach, which of course we can say is a critique of the essentialist approach, according to which the superior logic or the expression of a deeper objectivity that will be exterior to the practice that brings this order into being. I think this approach, I will even say more than that essentialist approach, you can't possibly understand and pose the question of the role, and certainly the political role of artistic practices, because well, first, of course, you will not speak of hegemony, but then, the development of the spirit of whatever thing you can think of, but it's not the result of a discursive construction. So here what I want to emphasize is that this constructed is crucial to pose the question of how is architecture political, and for artistic practices also. But it's not only the question of the discursive construction of the social. Together, on one side, the critique of essentialism, which is found in post-structuralism, with the work of Antonio Gramsci. And the fact that this construction is always an hegemonic construction, it's always a construction that is established through the view of our hegemonic view, and for instance, a position like the one of Bruno Latour in his idea of compositionism. Because Latour is also, I mean, we've got in common, we can call this there. But what is missing, in my view, in the approach of Latour, is this idea that this construction is always done through a power relation. And in fact, in this compositionism, this compositionism can be questioned, but the question that you can pose is, is something being well composed or badly composed? It does not pose the question in terms of the power relation. I think this is why I'm saying, discursive construction of the social is not enough, because that can be found both in different ways in Latour compositionism and in our view, because there is also the question of the power relation, which are always at stake. This is to give you some kind of general view of the ontological premises of our approach. Now, of course, one of the questions, I suppose, we are a critical architecture. Well, I think that what is important, once you recognize the role of this in the construction of an hegemony, then in fact you realize that, and that in a sense goes to the kind of question that Vittorio Aureli was asking. I will say that, but I will say the same with respect to architecture. I mean, architectural practices have necessary political character, because architectural practices are, as far as they are, always the maintenance or the transformation. So, for instance, with respect to artistic practices, I've made the argument, and I think I would really want to translate that into architecture, that it does not make sense to speak of because every form of art, of artistic practices, are part of the hegemonic construction. So they either reproduce, maintain an hegemonic construction, or they criticize it. So I propose art, the art which is normally called political. Abandoning the idea that there are some form of art that are supposedly non-political. I will say the same for architecture. But of course, doesn't mean that if every form of architecture is critical. And then address to show how it should be addressed according to our approach. And this is where we need to introduce the category of agonism. But let me just tell, well, in fact, to ask the question, how can artistic practices or art be critical, according to our approach, to the counter-hegemonic struggle? Because this is, for me, that where they become really artistic practices, or they become political in the critical way. And when I began order to really understand the possibility of counter-hegemonic practices, you needed to ask the question, I mean, what is really at stake in democracy? How does one need to be able to ask this question of the counter-hegemonic practices, you know, and of course also hegemonic practices, because there are some form of understanding of democracy that does not allow you to see that. And for instance, this different, the existing model of democracy, the aggregative model and the deliberative model, who for the aggregative model, democratic institutions basically, you know, serve to aggregate interests, people acting in the field of politics, get them, and the institution, you know, to decide among them. This is what democracy is about. Against this very, you know, limited view of democracy, there's been a development of the model called deliberative democracy, represented in different ways by John Rawls in the US or Georgia interest. There is also a moral dimension. There is, in fact, democracy is the way where consensus, some kind of rational consensus, a search for the common good is going to be established. And the role of hegemony, and does not allow you to imagine the possibility of hegemonic struggle or a struggle between different forms of hegemony. And it is in that context that I developed what I've called the agonistic, and that's the basic difference between the two approaches of democracy that I have referred to and mine, is that the agonistic approach starts from the question, we need to acknowledge the inner deliberative approach. They believe that precisely it's not, the aim is creation of consensus, so there is the possibility of eliminating antagonism. If you accept that antagonism cannot be eliminated, then should, you know, and that's also the moment where, you know, my work developed very much with and against Carl Schmitt, because I agree with Schmitt's premises that the political has got to do with, you know, what he called a friend and it's a pluralist democracy, liberal democracy. It's unthinkable, because for Schmitt, democracy negates liberalism, and liberalism negates democracy, so it is necessarily an unviable regime. But so the challenge for me was a pluralist democracy, and my solution to that you know, challenge is the model of agonistic democracy, because I say, yes, Schmitt is, I agree with him, there is this dimension which is ineradicable, but these different ways. There is the antagonism, strictly speaking, the Schmittian form, friend-enemy, but there is also a way to institutionalize, to give form to this conflict. But basically, an antagonism is a conflict which is nothing, but the properly political conflict, and that's one of my theses, are conflict we do not have a rational solution. So they are, in that sense, antagonistic, but they can be put into shape or into form in a way in which, instead of having the objective is simply to eradicate the enemy, you have a struggle between adversaries. Adversaries who know that there is absolutely no possibility of a rational solution to their conflict, but of their opponents. So they are not going to try to destroy them, to eradicate them, but they are going to accept some procedure to I call a conflictual consensus. There is some form of consensus in that sense, so there is some form of symbolic terrain, because they agree that those are what I call the ethico-political principle that should be for all, but they give completely different and oppose or conflicting, at least, interpretation of what is liberty, what is equality, and what is the whole. And this is a form of institutionalizing the conflict. Then we can see that it is possible, even starting from Schmittian premises, to envisage the possibility of pluralist democracy. Because, of course, opening the door to the civil war is right there, of course. And this is not compatible with democracy. But if you accept that this antagonism, the conflict is not going to be eliminated, but it's going to be, institutionalized in form possible to envisage pluralist democracy on that way. So this is what my agonistic model is about. And so we could say that basically it's a question of transforming antagonism into an agonism. And this is also why I have, I'm not going to develop that here again, but I've distinguished my understanding of agonism of other forms of agonism, the one, for instance, which are influenced by Anna Arendt and Roine Martins, have already referred to, or William Connolly, or in Canada, Jim Tully, who have this form of antagonism, which I'll call an antagonism, an agonism without antagonism. Because for them, they don't stand, in fact, and that's what I was saying at the beginning, they locate themselves into the associative conception of the political. No, it's a different form of agonism, which is, of course, linked to a different form of understanding pluralism, because everybody is to say, yeah, there are a multiplicity of point of view, and of course, we are not going to be able to occupy all of them because of, basically, they see the empirical limitation, life is too short, but see the world from both, and see all those point of view, it can that this observer will see that as conforming some kind of harmonious whole. This is what liberal pluralism is basically about. But this is, of course, and that's but if you start from the dissociative view, you don't have that view of pluralism. You have a view of pluralism like the one that you find in the work of Max Weber or in Nietzsche, in which they say pluralism necessarily a type form of antagonism. Because some of them are based on the very negation of some other value. You see? So I think that's very important to envisage pluralism in that way. And it also, and here I want to make reference to, for instance, I don't think that, of course, one is entitled to use agonism in different ways, but I don't see at all the struggle of the dissident in the USSR that is necessarily a form of democratic politics. When you, for instance, I did not think that, imagine the struggle against Mubarak in Egypt, or this is, in order to have an agonistic struggle, you need to have some form of democratic institution. And the agonistic struggle is a struggle within democratic institutions in order to fight for different hegemonic orders. This series of conceptual distinction which need to be grasped if you want to use categories in a precise way. This also, in fact, I comment with respect to in fact, one of the titles, the way in which this debate was presented, let me see, I don't think I've got it here. It is basically the distinction, because there is a tendency to collapse. And for instance, yeah, this is, I'm presented as a radical democratic theorist, radical democracy is not a theory. Radical democracy is a political project. So what we, in the first part, a theoretical approach, which is, can be called the hegemonic approach, the discursive approach, and then at the end of the last chapter is to say, if you formulate the socialist project, and then we say, yeah, that this approach helps us to reformulate the democratic project, the socialist project, in terms of a radical democracy. But radical democracy is not a theory. between radical democracy and agonistic democracy. A lot of people use that, you know, as if it was the same thing. No, radical democracy is one of the political projects that can be part of the agonistic. And it's an analytical approach that does not privilege in any way the radical democratic project. You know, you can't say, and that's a mistake which is made very often, that if you start from an agonistic project, no. I mean, once you've got an agonistic struggle in which different projects are at stake, nothing guarantees at all the victory of the radical democratic project. This is going to depend on the forces of the adversaries in a political position or better to say the other way, between a theoretical position and a political project. And this is why I'm also very critical of tendency. I mean, there's a risk. I find that very, very, very problematic, to say the least, because I don't think that they are left-wing ontologies, an ontology that automatically will bring about a political project. No. In the same way, here, society is something which is perfectly, you know, usable by people who do not defend a radical project. You can, you know, on the right, who find this project perfectly. I said, yeah, democracy should have a real fight between, you know, the left and the right. This is what it is about. So there is no link, necessarily link between a theoretical political load, because it avoids some misunderstanding. Well, let's now come to my last point, and here I'm going to try to make a few references to what has been said earlier, and it comes the different way in which radical politics can be conceived today. Because I think that to this question, you know, how to envisage a critical architecture, again, is going, let's call it a radical politics. A radical politics for me is a politics that wants to challenge the neoliberal order. And it's not a revolutionary politics. And this is something which I'm leaving aside, because it's not the basic, well, it still, you know, exists today, even if it's rather marginalized, but there are, in my view, two main way to conceive radical politics today. One which I've called strategy wit. And according to the strategy that you advocate, you are going to ask the question of critical architecture in a very different way. For me, the strategy of wit and Paolo Virno, the best known names, another name of strategy of exodus. And they want the self-organization of the multitude, and they say we should not engage with existing institutions, basically to more or less disappear. And it's not something that, in a sense, one could say, yes, it's a pure negation of the existing order, and what we have advocated, and that is since hegemony and socialist strategy, is a strategy, but that borrowing, again, a term from Gramsci, one can call a strategy of war of position, of engagement, those institutions. And this is why, and that is an answer to a question, I think it was Sarah who was mentioning that, for me, critique is never, I mean, according to the view that I advocate, critique is of, in fact, the strategy, hegemonic strategy is a strategy of disarticulation, re-articulation. You know, you need to, of course, disarticulate a certain hegemony, but you need to create something new. And this is, for instance, what we call the day after question. I think that, of course, is very important. It's not simply a question, okay, we negate that and then things are going to, you know, arise. No, when I speak of critique, it's re-articulation. That for me is very, very important. That's the strategy of the war of position. And I think, it seemed to me, but of course this is a question that you will be able to answer better than myself, that I can't really think of the kind of architectural practices that will correspond to this strategy of exodus. You know, it seems to be and that's why I think, for instance, in architecture, with construction, with mediation, which are precisely all the things that the desertion exodus strategy wants to reject. And you can't really imagine architecture without this. When one is trying to envisage the possibility of a critical architecture, it should be done under the mode of this strategy of engagement with, and not on the strategy. And also there is something, well, it is not, Reinhold Martin did not mention that in his paper today, but it's in a piece which he sent me to read. He said that, and I agree very much with that. He said, don't revolutionary architecture, you are not going to make the revolution to architecture. I can't imagine what it could be. But of course, architectural practices can contribute to making profound transformation. Revolutionary, it's difficult to imagine. So if one is imagining architectural practices, you know, critical architectural practices, well, I will take it is there a process of re-articulation and addressing the different, well, it's something of course that takes place. Agonistic struggle, there is precisely offering an alternative. This is what the agonism is about. You know, the movement of disarticulation of the given hegemony in order to make a proposal for something different. This is what always, and it can take place in many different areas, but of course there are privileged points, which are the point that I was referring before as the nodal points in which, you know, a given hegemony is a very special, important place. Because I will see Ozink as one of those nodal points in which, you know, an hegemony structure. So definitively one area which is central for. And I like very much what Pier Vittorio Aureli say concerning Red Vienna. I think Red Vienna is definitively for me an example of an agonistic architecture. That it's definitively a privileged space for architectural practices to contribute to the counter-hegemony. Let me see what, yeah, so that's, already kind of mentioned that, but I must say I'm very suspicious of the idea of dissidence in here, because I think that, I mean, this does not really, the practice she refers to, they don't chime with my understanding of war of position, more with the idea of the strategy of exodus, even if it's not quite that, but definitively I think that is not something which correspond to the idea and against neoliberal hegemony understood in terms of a war of position, an engagement with institution and with the state. So I'm not saying that those are not important kind of thing of practice of agonistic practices, because as I already mentioned, agonistic practices require the existence of some, you know, democratic form. It's a struggle within democratic form. For really think of you know, the USSR in terms of an hegemonic thing that need to be thing is different kind of politics there. Yeah. Well, that's I think in here what is my position with respect to the question that is posed by Pier Vittorio Aureli, sorry, about when they speak architecture is always political, that in different ways, but I think, yeah, architecture is always political. It is always a political dimension, but is not always political in the sense that it's all. But of course, it's also not always political in the sense of being critical or being an attempt to disarticulate an existing hegemony. Actual practices, for me, either contribute to sustain and reproduce the existing hegemony or to disrupt them. So there is always, this aspect, consensus conflict. And I will also agree that there is always a dimension of consensus in architectural practices, but in this sense. In the sense that it is even in a counter-hegemonic way, there is inherently in architectural practices some attempt at creating form of consensus. Because it is to organize our common life to hegemonic architecture is an attempt. There is a dimension of consensus, but in order to disarticulate one form of consensus, to create another form of consensus around different values, different way of understanding how we are going to organize our common life. So there is always this element of consensus, dissensus. So it seemed to me that although we say it in a different way, we are on an agreement on this point. Sarah, I think I've already, in a sense, indicated that, for me, critique is never, and I think we agree on that, because she was saying, but it's not enough. Yeah, I agree with that, absolutely. It's never enough to have the negative part of critique. You always need to have the constructive part. It's a process, as I was saying, of disarticulation, re-articulation. And with respect to what she said about Lyotard, I do find Lyotard very interesting, and definitively his idea of different, but the different is not agonism. Because the different has got more to do with antagonism. I think that at some point she said the different requires, automatically imply or something like that, agonism. No. Antagonism, yes. But the whole question of agonism is given that we are in a situation in which they are different, they are the possibility of antagonism. How are we going to organize our life so that we can live together, in state of killing each other? And that is really what is at stake in agonism. So the different for me is got to do with what we call antagonism, but agonism is not automatically the consequence of the different. Is the challenge for recognizing the existence of the different. Well, I think that's all I can say at the moment. Thank you.